A stormy night, a stranded judge, a man whose kindness would one day decide his fate. This is the story of Jerome Wells, a hardworking father, falsely accused. Betrayed by power and pushed to the edge until the truth fought its way back. Jerome Wells had always lived quietly, the kind of man who carried responsibility on his shoulders without ever complaining. At 34, he worked 3 different jobs just to keep life steady for his 10-year-old daughter, Amelia. To her, he was a superhero. To the world, he was invisible. During the day, he sat at a desk as a junior accountant, crunching numbers that never seemed to add up until one afternoon he realized why. Hidden inside those spreadsheets, tucked between manufactured invoices and suspicious transfers, he uncovered a trail of embezzlement so blatant it froze him. The man behind it all was his boss, Richard Blackstone, the kind of executive who shook hands with politicians and smiled too confidently for someone with so much to hide. Jerome knew reporting him would be dangerous, but he couldn't unsee what he had uncovered. And he refused to raise his daughter in a world where he kept silent about wrongdoing. That choice, made with a steady heart and clean conscience, quietly sealed his fate. A few nights later, he was on his 3rd shift of the week, working as a night security guard for a warehouse that always smelled of oil and loneliness. When the shift finally ended, Jerome stepped into the kind of storm that swallowed sound. Rain fell in sheets so heavy the world blurred into streaks of silver. Lightning snapped across the sky like the cracking of some ancient whip. He drove slowly, both hands gripping the steering wheel, thinking about Amelia asleep at home, and hoping the thunder hadn't woken her. The road ahead was empty, a long stretch of asphalt cutting through farmland. When he noticed a set of hazard lights flickering weakly in the distance, a black BMW sat half-tilted near the ditch, its engine steaming. Jerome slowed down, but hesitation knotted itself in his chest. A black man, alone in the middle of nowhere, at 2 a.m. Approaching a stranded white woman, it could look wrong in 100 different ways. He heard his mother's voice, soft but firm, echoing through memory. If you can help, you help. God handles the rest. He exhaled, wiped rain from his brow, and pulled over. When he stepped out, the storm immediately drenched him. But he moved forward anyway. The woman inside the BMW rolled down her window just an inch at first, her voice tense as she asked who he was and what he wanted. Jerome kept a respectful distance, hands visible, tone gentle. He explained that he had seen the hazard lights and wanted to check if she was all right. Her eyes scanned him uncertain, calculating until another crack of lightning startled her and she finally stepped out. The tire was shredded, the engine whining from her attempts to restart it. Jerome worked with calm efficiency, speaking only when necessary, guiding her through the safest place to stand while he jacked up the car and replaced the tire. Rain plastered his shirt to his skin, mud splashed up his arms, but he kept going because that was who he was. When he finished, she thanked him with a voice that carried both relief and the faintest trace of embarrassment for her earlier suspicion. Before she got back into her car, she asked for his name. Jerome simply wiped his hands on his pants and answered, "Jerome Wells." She repeated it softly, almost as if she wanted to commit it to memory. He nodded once, offered a polite smile, and drove away into the storm, unaware that she watched his taillights fade until they disappeared completely. Unaware that she was Judge Kendall Morrison, a woman known for her strict sentencing and unshakable poise. Unaware that their brief encounter would become a silent weight in her conscience. Weeks later, Jerome found himself standing inside a courtroom that smelled of polished wood and cold judgment. He had reported the embezzlement to the authorities, believing truth would win. Instead, the truth twisted against him. Blackstone had money, connections, and a well-crafted lie. Suddenly, the transfers pointed to Jerome. The forged signatures matched his perfectly. The spreadsheets he had reported were now evidence against him. The prosecution called him greedy, desperate, even unstable. Jerome watched helplessly as his life was repainted in colors he didn't recognize. When the judge finally entered, Jerome felt his breath catch. The woman from the storm, her hair swept back, her robe flowing, her expression carved in stone. For a moment her eyes widened, just barely. Recognition flickered there. She knew him. She remembered him, but she said nothing. Not when the evidence twisted against him. Not when his plea broke beneath the weight of lies. And not when she delivered a verdict that shattered the world of the man who had once helped her without expecting anything in return. The weeks after the trial felt like watching his own life collapse in slow motion. Jerome Wells had always believed that if you worked hard, stayed honest, and kept faith in the system, the world would eventually treat you fairly. But the system had turned its back on him, and now everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. The accounting firm fired him within hours of the verdict. The security company removed him from the schedule without even calling. Just an automated email telling him his access card had been deactivated. Word spread fast. Neighbors who once waved at him now looked through him as if he were a ghost. Parents at Amelia's school whispered behind cupped hands, wondering how a man like him had hidden such greed for so long. It didn't matter that none of it was true. The stain stuck anyway. Within a month, he could no longer afford the apartment. The landlord, apologetic but firm, gave him a week to clear out. Jerome packed what little they had left into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box filled with Amelia's toys. They moved into a single, cramped room in Mrs. Esperanza's aging 2-story house. She was kind, the kind of woman who saw more than people said, and she charged him almost nothing. Still, the humiliation of carrying his daughter into a stranger's home pressed on him like a tightening chest. Amelia tried to make it easier, drawing pictures to tape on the wall, telling jokes at breakfast, pretending to fall asleep quickly so he wouldn't know she heard him crying quietly at night. She was only 10. Yet somehow she held herself like she was protecting him instead of the other way around. But it wasn't just the weight of loss that pulled Jerome downward. It was realizing how deep the corruption ran. While he struggled to keep Amelia fed, Richard Blackstone was celebrating in private circles, his reputation glowing brighter than ever. Blackstone had planned everything from the beginning. He had manipulated the accounting software, forged digital signatures, created false audit trails, and built a system so carefully twisted that if anything went wrong, it all pointed to Jerome. It wasn't incompetence. It was engineering. And as Jerome slowly pieced together what had happened, one fact hit him harder than any accusation. The stolen money hadn't come from corporate funds. It had come from places already bleeding: public schools, community clinics, low-income housing grants. Every dollar Blackstone pocketed had been carved out of neighborhoods like the one Jerome had grown up in. Kids like he had once been. Mothers who skipped meals to feed their children. Elderly people who counted coins before buying medicine. One afternoon, while Amelia napped in their small room, Jerome sat alone in the dim light, staring at the silent phone in his hand. Everything inside him churned: anger, humiliation, disbelief. Without thinking much about what he hoped to gain, he dialed Richard Blackstone. The call connected on the second ring. Richard's voice carried the smooth arrogance of a man who had never suffered consequences. He laughed before Jerome even finished the first sentence. He mocked him for thinking anyone would ever believe a nobody accountant over a respected executive. He bragged about how easy it had been to twist the evidence, how the judges and board members trusted him blindly. Then his tone sharpened, turning almost venomous as he told Jerome to accept failure like a man, and warned him not to try anything else unless he wanted things to get even worse. The call was meant to break him. Instead, something inside Jerome shifted. The grief, the fear, the shame, they all settled into something colder, steadier, sharper. A kind of determination that felt like steel forming in fire. He didn't shout back. He didn't defend himself. He simply listened, expression empty, until Richard finished. Then Jerome ended the call with a quiet calm that surprised even him. What Richard didn't know was that Jerome had a habit most people found annoying. Never deleted anything. Not emails, not drafts, not old spreadsheets, not system logs. His computer was a graveyard of backups, saved in folders and side folders, some of them years old. And that habit born from caution, maybe even insecurity, was now his hidden weapon. That night, after Amelia fell asleep, Jerome opened his old laptop. A faint hum filled the room as the screen flickered to life. He began digging. Old correspondence, financial records, server logs he had copied without thinking, archived spreadsheets from audits long past. Piece by piece, he reconstructed the puzzle knot, the one Richard had built for the courtroom, but the real one. As hours turned into nights, and nights into weeks, patterns began to emerge. Transfers, he remembered questioning. Signatures that didn't match. Accounts that didn't exist. Using nothing but persistence and wounded resolve, he mapped 8 years of embezzlement, tracing the disappearing funds across shell companies and fake contractors. When he finally added it all up, he stared at the number glowing on the screen. $16 million. 16 million stolen from people who needed it most, and for the first time since his life had fallen apart. Jerome didn't feel powerless. He felt purposeful, dangerous, awake. Jerome waited in the back booth of a dimly lit diner, the kind of place where the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air in the rain. Tapping against the windows seemed louder than the conversations inside. He had chosen this place carefully, no cameras, no familiar faces, nothing to connect him to what he was about to do. He clutched a flash drive in his hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. When Detective Marcus Thompson finally walked in, he carried the quiet authority of a man who had seen more corruption than he cared to admit. Marcus wasn't flashy or loud. His eyes did most of the talking, and tonight they scanned the room before landing on Jerome with sharp focus. He slid into the booth without a word, and Jerome handed him the drive like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Marcus plugged it into his tablet and scrolled through the files and silence old logs, spreadsheets, archived emails, hidden transfers. His calm expression slowly shifted into something closer to disbelief, then suspicion. Then a grim, tightened jaw that told Jerome he was seeing the truth. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. He said the evidence wasn't just good. It was explosive. The pattern of theft stretched far beyond Blackstone's office. There were signatures from city officials, invoices from shell companies tied to political donors, transfers routed through offshore accounts belonging to people whose names were whispered in back rooms, but never spoken publicly. Marcus leaned back, almost as if the weight of what he had learned was pressing him deeper into the seat. He told Jerome that if they pursued this, they wouldn't just be going after one corrupt executive, they'd be ripping open a network that could shake the entire city. That night was the beginning of a hidden alliance, one built on the fragile tension between desperation and duty. For the next several weeks, Jerome and Marcus worked in absolute secrecy. They met in parking lots, abandoned offices, and public libraries where no one expected to see a detective at midnight. Marcus taught Jerome what federal investigators looked for, how to categorize evidence, how to trace signatures with more precision than any accountant ever needed. Jerome brought determination, the kind sharpened by injustice and sleepless nights. Together, they built a case layer by layer, cross-checking every digital trail, matching forged contracts with the real ones, and digging through offshore accounts that hadn't been touched in years. Every time they thought they had reached the bottom, another hidden tunnel opened. And with each discovery, Jerome's anger became less like a blaze and more like a quiet, controlled fire. By the third week, their files were no longer just evidence, they were a map of greed stretching across nearly a decade. Jerome had become so familiar with the patterns that he could predict Blackstone's next move without even seeing it. And one night, after staring at the latest bank logs, he decided it was time to remind Richard Blackstone that the man he tried to destroy wasn't broken after all. He dialed Richard's number again, the same number he had been mocked through weeks earlier. But this time, when Richard answered with the same arrogant confidence, Jerome didn't let him speak. He began reading out loud. Account numbers, dates, amounts, offshore transfers. False contractor I.D.'s every detail spoken with calm precision. Richard's silence on the other end said everything. His breathing became uneven, his voice a strained whisper, as he asked how Jerome had found all this. Jerome didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fear in Richard's voice was enough. The call ended not with threats, but with Richard realizing for the first time that the man he underestimated could now destroy him. One evening, after another long session of reviewing evidence with Marcus, Jerome stepped outside the diner to clear his mind. The rain had returned softer this time, tapping rhythmically against the pavement. As he walked toward his car, headlights swept across him, and a familiar black BMW rolled slowly past the intersection. He paused, heart tightening. There was something about the way the taillights curved, something etched into his memory since that stormy night months ago. Without thinking, he got into his car and followed. The BMW didn't speed or swerve. It moved confidently through the streets, turning into a gated neighborhood where houses stood large and silent like monuments. Jerome watched from a distance as the car pulled into a driveway. When the driver stepped out, umbrella in hand, he felt the breath leave his chest. Judge Kendall Morrison, the woman he had helped in the rain, the woman who had sentenced him while remembering his kindness, the woman whose eyes had flickered with guilt that day in the courtroom was the owner of that BMW. She paused at her door. Looking back for a moment as if sensing someone watching, Jerome sank lower in his seat, realization crashing into him. Fate had woven them together long before the courtroom, and now, she might be the only person with enough power and enough conscience to tip the scales in his favor. The morning of the federal raid began like any other day in the city, quiet and unassuming. With commuters rushing through their routines, unaware that a storm was coming, one far more precise than any thundercloud Jerome had ever driven through. At 6:14 a.m., an entire fleet of black SUVs rolled toward the polished glass building of Blackstone Construction. Agents moved with synchronized purpose, their jackets marked with the bold letters that struck fear into those who deserved it. The moment the first battering ram hit the door, the illusion of Richard Blackstone's untouchable empire shattered. Employees froze as agents flooded the lobby, seizing computers, locking down offices, opening secured vaults, and downloading financial records that matched perfectly with the data Jerome and Marcus had mapped for weeks. Richard tried to demand answers, tried to invoke his political connections, but the agents barely looked at him. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs, charged with money laundering, tax fraud, conspiracy, and the full weight of 8 years of theft. All the power he once wielded evaporated in the span of an hour, leaving nothing but a man confronted by the truth he thought he had, buried forever. Jerome arrived at the federal building later that morning with Marcus beside him. He was escorted into a secure conference room where evidence screens covered the walls. For the first time since his life had crumbled, Jerome felt something close to steady ground beneath his feet. He laid out the files he had spent countless nights assembling, years of spreadsheets, hidden logs, forged signatures, offshore transfers, and coded emails. The agents listened with a seriousness that told him his voice mattered again. They asked precise questions, and Jerome answered with the clarity of a man who had rebuilt the truth, piece by piece. On the other side of a one-way mirror, Richard Blackstone sat in a metal chair, pale, sweating, and unable to look away from the man he had framed. He watched as Jerome calmly dismantled every lie, every forged trail, every fabricated accusation, and, for the first time, Richard understood the depth of his mistake. He had tried to destroy someone whose integrity was stronger than his corruption. By the afternoon, there was no escaping the truth. The investigation team called Jerome the key witness, the missing puzzle piece that made the entire network collapse. The prosecutors thanked him. Agents shook his hand. But the moment that hit him the hardest came a day later when his phone rang with a number he didn't expect to see. Judge Kendall Morrison's voice was softer than he remembered, carrying something heavy beneath the surface. She told him she had reviewed the evidence personally. She had spoken with federal officials, and that she owed him more than just a professional correction. She owed him the truth she hadn't been brave enough to face months earlier in her courtroom. She admitted that she remembered the night he helped her in the rain, that she had recognized him the moment she saw him standing before her. And though she didn't make excuses for staying silent, her voice trembled when she said she was sorry. Later that week, Jerome's conviction was overturned in an emergency court session. The judge who signed the order called the case a grave injustice, and the room erupted in a quiet applause that felt like a wave washing over him. For the first time in months, Jerome walked outside without feeling the weight of shame or whispering voices behind him. Compensation was granted, public apologies were issued, and the headlines that once painted him as a criminal now described him as the whistleblower who had exposed one of the largest corruption schemes in the city's history. Meanwhile, Richard Blackstone stood before a new judge, one who did not hesitate. The sentence was swift and heavy: 22 years in federal prison. The man who once walked with political kings was let out in shackles, a sobering reminder that greed always demands its price. In the months that followed, the world Jerome stepped into looked nothing like the one that had once cast him aside. Federal prosecutors reached out with an offer he never expected. They wanted him to join their office not as an accountant, but as the director of auditing, overseeing an entire division dedicated to uncovering corruption. It was Marcus who insisted Jerome take the role, calling him the most relentless investigator I've ever met, and the federal board agreed. Jerome accepted, not out of pride, but because he had felt the cost of injustice too personally to ever ignore it again. Soon after, he was appointed to lead a national task force, traveling across states to train other auditors and investigators, turning his once painful past into a powerful mission. But the moment that mattered more than any job offer or press headline came the night he returned home to Amelia. She greeted him with a smile brighter than anything he had seen in months, holding a drawing she had made at school. It showed him, standing tall with a badge on his chest, and beneath it, she had written, "My dad is a hero." Jerome knelt beside her, the exhaustion of months melting away as she wrapped her arms around him. In that embrace, he understood that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty or clearing his name. It was also about giving his daughter a future where truth mattered. Years later, when Jerome reflected on everything that had happened, he realized how strangely life had woven the path before him. The night he had stopped in the rain to help a stranger had felt like a simple act of decency, something anyone should do. Yet that moment had become a turning point. A spark that would lead him to uncover a web of corruption, transform his fate, and protect countless lives.
Whisper, murder on grass right along with your white
That integrity made him vulnerable. That honesty would always lose to power. But he had learned the truth the hard way. Kindness is a strength. Integrity is a shield. Honesty can topple empires when wielded by someone who refuses to break. And in the end, that rainy night did more than save him. It reshaped a broken system and became the beginning of a legacy he never expected to leave behind.